In 2016, at the age of 23, I missed out on being selected for my second Olympic Games. And this is my story. So following on from London 2012, going into the start of 2013, it was a new year. I had a good Christmas. I was ready. I was back in the gym. I was working hard. I was doing all the things I needed to now be a professional athlete again. And I was preparing, and my main goal had shifted, and it was now the 2016 Olympic Games. And I think after winning in some ways, a surprise medal in London 2012, it kind of, for me personally, became a bit of an expectation that I would be there again in 4 years' time. And this time I was going for an individual medal and trying to win a gold medal. Now, at the start of that year, training was going really well. I did great in the British Championships at the start of that year. I think I won floor, medalled on a few other apparatus, and I qualified a spot for the European Championship team in Moscow. So this was going to be my first big individual competition on the back of the Olympic Games, and now going into that event as an Olympic medalist. And that carried with it, I guess, its own expectations and pressure. But more than anything, I was just excited to get started in what I felt was going to be my Olympic cycle this time. In many ways, London was a bit of a bonus. I was only 19. But I've been told the whole way through my gymnastics career that the peak age for a male gymnast was about 23 years old. And all my favourite gymnasts and the greats had gone on to win their all-around medals at the Olympic Games at around the age of 23. So for me, I'm thinking, this is it. This is my shot to try and win an Olympic gold medal and achieve that dream I set for myself when I was a child. Now, at that competition, like I said, I did really, really well in Moscow at the European Championships. I qualified for 2 apparatus finals. So I qualified for the floor and the high bar events. In the floor event, I had a little bit of a mistake, but it wasn't my best event at the time. And going into the high bar, I was really confident. 2 years before that, I'd been at the European Championships in Berlin. I'd finished 4th, made history, first British gymnast to ever qualify for a major championship final. So I had that experience in my locker now, and I'd had the experience of the Olympic Games. And in many ways, competing in front of 20,000 people at the O2 and almost millions of people watching on TV, and that pressure cauldron we were in, any major championships after that was never really going to be quite as intimidating. And that certainly helped in that event in Moscow. And I went into that final with a lot of confidence. Now, I'd had an experience in a World Cup final where I'd qualified first as an 18-year-old in front of the world champion, Olympic medalists, and basically the very best on high bar in the world. And I'd kind of panicked and surprised myself that I'd qualified first. And in the final on the Sunday, the four first gymnasts to compete went up, and they all fell. And I went into panic mode then and kind of started thinking about the outcome. And if I stay on here, I'm going to win a medal, rather than thinking about my routine. So I used that experience here in Moscow. I was competing late on in the rotation, so there were 8 gymnasts competing. I think I was 7th. I went to the back gym, did my last little warm-up, walked out, and as I walked out, I saw one of my idols, Fabian Hambuchen, the German gymnast, who I'd actually watched on TV at the Olympic Games back in 2004 when I was 11 years old in the high bar final, and I'm now competing with him. He's become my rival, which is really cool, and he fell from the high bar. But this time I kept nice and calm and just focused on the job that I had to do, and I did a great routine. It was the hardest routine I'd done up to that point. I was really, really proud of it. And I came away with a silver medal. So Great Britain's first ever high bar medal at a major championships. And that's something I'm really, really proud of, because it's always hard to be the first. You know, to be the first athlete or the first team to win a medal and break history. There's no blueprint. No one's come before and done it. So you kind of, it's almost a lonely place to be on that journey to that. So for me, I was really, really proud of that achievement. It was great for my self-confidence. You know, it kind of gave me a little bit of, it was a positive thing that could have happened after the back of London 2012 and falling off on the high bar in the team final. It gave me a real confidence booster, knowing that, I'm really good at high bar and this is something that I'm supposed to be here. So that was great for me. And I kicked on from that in the summer. I qualified for the World Championships team. I only competed on one apparatus, so I did the floor. It was just an individual year, so there was no team events that year. But I actually went into that competition with a small fracture in my foot. So it was funny. I had a fracture in my foot, but I was competing on floor. So I struggled through that. Didn't get the best result, but had another great opportunity to gain some experience as just a young 20-year-old. And going into that winter, I was selected to represent Great Britain in the World Cup circuit. So along with Dan Purvis, I went on a little World Cup circuit all around the world, competing in America, Germany, Glasgow, Japan, competing against the very best all-arounders in the world. And for me, this was great. This was an amazing experience to not just be competing as an individual on single apparatus. I was doing all six, because my target from when I was a young kid was to be an all-around gymnast. Every single gymnast starts out as an all-arounder, and whether it's through injury, their body type, whether they're a bit too tall and struggle on some of the apparatus, everyone's dream when you start out in gymnastics is to be an all-rounder, and through circumstance people end up specialising on certain events. But for me, that was the goal, that was the be-all and end-all. And I think all the gymnasts respect the all-around champions the most, because they know how hard it is to split all your training time over 6 apparatus and to get good, to be able to use your whole body, to be able to hang on the high bar, to use your strength on the rings, to have the technique and the patience on pommel horse, but to have the power to do the vault and the floor. It's a really different animal to be an all-around gymnast. So this was great. I was getting loads of experience competing with the best in the world. And I used that as a springboard then to kick on into 2014. And at the British Championships, I did really well. I think I finished in the top 3 all around, won a couple of apparatus gold medals as well, was selected for the European team in Sofia, which is Bulgaria. And it was the first opportunity we had to compete as a team since the Olympic Games in London. So this was big for me. And I went into that competition almost wanting to prove something, I think, to myself a little bit. I wanted to be the guy that people could depend on. And consistency for me was really, really important at this time. And I'd had loads of competitions over the winter doing that World Cup circuit to work on that. So I went in full of confidence. It was an interesting experience as well. It was the first time I'd really experienced probably somebody that was one of my teammates being in the position where they felt they should have been in a team instead of me. So Lewis had just made a comeback at that point. His big goal was the Commonwealth Games in the summer, but he'd come back quite early. He'd been to the British Championships, done very well on pommel horse, and he felt that he should be in the team instead of me. So that was the first experience for me. It was quite difficult because I grew up with Lewis and he was an idol of mine, and I took that as a young 21-year-old, still super insecure. I took that quite personally. I understand now, looking back, that, a sport like mine is an individual sport and you have to do what's best for yourself. But for me at the time, I didn't really understand that. And I felt that, everybody around me was then thinking, wow, Sam's made the team. Has he made the team because his coach is part of the GB setup? He doesn't deserve to be there. So I really had something to prove going into that competition. But I think the bonus for me was that my training was going so well and I was getting really good results at the international competitions that we were doing in the friendly competitions in the lead up to that. I had a lot of confidence in myself and I competed really well in that event. So I only did 4 apparatus. I did the rings, the vault, the parallel bars and the high bar. And in some ways, I did kind of get my redemption, and that really helped me. So in that team final, some of my teammates there, they struggled a little bit and didn't have the best day of competition and made a few mistakes. And I did really well, and I felt like I was able to be an anchor for the team on that day. And I smashed my routines. I actually stuck all of my dismounts on all those 4 apparatus, even the vault, got some of my best scores. And after that competition, I really, really felt that I deserved to be in this place. I am one of the best all-rounders in the country, and it was all eyes on the Rio Olympics and pushing for that World Championships and Commonwealth Games later that year in 2014. And I'd also managed to retain my high bar silver medal. So the silver medal that I got the year before, making history in Moscow, I retained that, and I finished second this time to the current Olympic champion. So for me, that was incredibly exciting. I stood on that podium next to Epke Zonderland, the London 2012 Olympic high bar champion, really thinking, wow, this is a realistic target for me now, being able to go to the Olympic Games and challenge for a medal. And again, like I said, that gave me a massive confidence boost going into the summer. My training continued to improve. I started doing more and more difficult gymnastics. I was getting more and more consistent in the gym. And I'd say that looking back now, that was probably my prime. That was the best I felt physically. I was doing the hardest gymnastics I'd probably competed. I think at the time going into that Commonwealth Games that summer, I had the 3rd highest all-around difficulty in the world. I got selected for the Commonwealth team. My coach wasn't wasn't going to go with me, Sergey. The coaches that went at the time were Max's coach and one of the national coaches, which was fine. I was now 21. I had a lot more experience of going to events and not having Sergey with me there all the time. But what I was doing at that competition was very, very difficult gymnastics. And I went into that competition trying to do a new vault for the very first time. Now, the vault apparatus for me is probably the most dangerous. It's the one where you've really got to psych yourself up and get into a very different type of mindset, because just so much happens in such a short space of time that if you lose your concentration for just a fraction of a second, there's a lot that can go wrong. And a lot of the serious injuries in gymnastics happen on the vault. And going into that event, one of the gymnastics manufacturers at the time had actually changed their springboard. So there was loads of developments in gymnastics equipment around that time. The floors were being modified. They were a lot bouncier. You were getting more height from them. The companies were trying to change the springboards. The gymnastics that was being done was way more difficult. People were pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And the vault I was doing was called a dragolescu. So I would do a forward flip, put my hands onto the vault, I'd do 2 somersaults, and then I'd add a half twist at the end. So that's all happening in the space of, from the start of a run-up to the end of the vault, you're doing that in less than 10 seconds for sure. It's not a long time. And when you're in the air, we're talking about split seconds. So I was prepared, I was ready to do that vault, but I was having issues with this new springboard. It just wasn't giving me much bounce, and it was the same for a lot of the other athletes. In fact, one of the Russian athletes that was one of the best vaulters in the world at that time had refused to use that springboard at the European Championships. So I was trying my best to be in a very positive mindset, but the mistake I probably made was in the build-up to that, I was using a different brand of springboard because I was just struggling so much to actually do the vault in training on that springboard. I knew I needed to get the numbers done in the gym, so I would use the other springboard, knowing full well when I got to the Commonwealth Games, I was going to have to use this springboard. But towards the end, I started to use that springboard in the last few weeks, the last few days, and certainly when I got to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow, I used that springboard. But I was struggling with it. It wasn't easy. But in the podium session, that dress rehearsal of the competition, it went fine, and I landed on my feet, so I was confident I could do the vault. And it wasn't just the vault I was doing difficult gymnastics on. I was doing difficult gymnastics on all 6 apparatus. And going into that event, I was super confident. I was one of the favourites there to do well, to get multiple apparatus finals, and also to qualify to the all-around final. Because it was a Commonwealth Games and the GB squad was split up into England, Scotland, Wales, I was going to have the chance of competing in the all-around and against some of my teammates that would represent Scotland as well. So it gave me a bigger chance of being in that all-around final. So it was a big moment for me. It was really exciting. I'd worked a long time for this opportunity. And the first day of competition, they'd done something very different. They'd split the competition into 2 days. So we were going to do the first free apparatus on day 1 and the second free apparatus on day 2. First day went brilliantly. Floor was amazing. I can remember walking out into the Hydro Arena in front of 10,000 people, Scottish fans mainly, to the Proclaimers 500 miles. And the sound in the arena was just deafening. And that's only the second time in my career I ever got those goosebumps all over my body when we walked out. And the media and the press, because our GB squad was kind of almost split evenly between having an England team and a Scotland team, they'd built up that rivalry a lot in the lead up to that competition. So the Scottish fans were really going for it. It was almost more like being in a football stadium. It was awesome. I was loving it. And I went out, smashed my floor routine. I had a mistake on the pommel horse, but I was doing the most difficult routine I'd done to that point and did a really good rings routine. So going into the second day, I was full of confidence. I was ready. I was excited. I was still going to have a very good chance of qualifying for the all-around final. And it was going to be vault first. So the vault was first, doing the big vault for the first time. No coach, Sergey wasn't there. So I'd rang him and spoke to him on the phone. But I had to, in many ways, kind of rely on myself, know what I was capable of, trust in my ability to do this vault. And in the warm-up, I'd warmed up the way I had in the dress rehearsal competition, the podium session, and it had gone well. And for that vault, it was so difficult and so dangerous, and so much can go wrong that you have to be in an all-in mindset. If there was any part of me that was umming and ahhing about whether I should just maybe do an easier vault or not, it would be dangerous. I had to be 100% all in. So that's the mindset I got myself into. And when we started on vault, I did my vault, and unfortunately, I just didn't get enough height. I didn't quite finish the turn, and I landed on my ankle, and essentially my ankle dislocated, and I completely ruptured the medial ligament on the inside of my ankle and all the lateral ligaments on the outside of my ankle. Now, I managed to hop on one leg and present to the judges, but I jumped down straight away, and I got wheelchaired off and carried off. And I can remember getting taken out into this back gym and still hearing the crowd. And in my head, I was genuinely thinking, like, can I get back out there to do parallel bars to help the team and still do something? And at this point, I had so much adrenaline, the pain hadn't kicked in. And it wasn't until probably 20, 25 minutes, the pain kicked in. And the doctor had already asked me if I wanted some painkillers. And I'd said, no, I'm okay. But I kind of said, yeah, can I have some painkillers now? So I got taken away, had scans, I had MRI scans and a CT scan. The x-rays came back, and the initial response was there's no breaks. So I thought, great, that's brilliant. When you hear there's no breaks, I've not broken my ankle or my leg or my foot, brilliant. That might not be too bad then. And later that evening, we'd gone back to the house in the Commonwealth Village, and I was sharing a room with Max at the time. And the doctor, there was a knock on my door from the national coach. He said, the doctor wants to see you. And we went into this room. It was really weird, actually. It was like a small little office. We sat in front of her, and I'd known her for a few years at this point. And she began to tell me that the MRI scans had come back. She got the results, and she was almost crying while she was telling me. And it was at that moment I kind of clocked on, and this is not going to be good news. And she essentially told me that it was very, very serious. I was going to have surgery, and there was a chance that I wasn't going to be able to do floor and vault again. And at that moment, I just did not know what to do with that information. I can remember going back to the room. You know, my mum and dad weren't there. Sergey wasn't there. I was in shock. I didn't expect that at all. I went back into bed. I started crying, and I can remember Max getting really worried, saying, Sam, what's wrong? And I told him. And then I said, I'm going to go. There was a spare room on the next floor. I said, I'll go stay in that room. I rang my mum and dad. I cried. I said, I want to go home. Can you take me home? So I stayed, I think, for the next day. And then my mum and dad took me home. And we drove back down. And I had no idea what was going to happen. And interestingly, the man that ended up doing the surgery on my ankle, a guy called James Calder, he had watched me do the vault on TV. He was on holiday with his family in Cornwall, and he'd seen it on TV. And when the first time I met him, he told me that he was just waiting for the phone call because he was the best ankle specialist in the whole of Great Britain. And my injury was very, very complicated. It was really complex. Because I dislocated it and completely ruptured all of the ligaments, I was going to need quite a difficult surgery. And the Olympic sports and the Olympic medical team, they hadn't experienced that injury before. So everything we did from that moment on was almost trial and error. And they didn't really have any idea, number one, how the surgery was going to turn out, if it would be successful, and number two, whether I was going to be able to make a full comeback and compete on 6 apparatus again. So at that point, there was a 2-week limbo because the surgeon was on holiday. They wanted the swelling to come down, and I basically spent 2 weeks in my bedroom watching the Commonwealth Games on TV with a crate of Budweiser, and I basically asked my dad to get me a bucket of KFC every night, and I stayed up till 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and my whole world just crashed down around me. At that point, my whole identity was tied into this idea of going to the Olympic Games and winning a gold medal. And for me, I can remember saying as a teenager, I can remember saying to people, and saying to myself, when I go to the Olympics and I win a gold medal, that's the hardest thing I'll ever do in my life. So anything after that is going to be easy. So once I retire from gymnastics, I'm just going to chill, which now I know is just a really unhealthy mindset to be in. But at that time, that's genuinely how I felt. It was life and death for me. It was the only thing I cared about. It was the only thing that was important to me. And it was everything that I measured my self-worth off. So to be told that you might never be able to do floor and vault again, which meant I was never going to have the opportunity to compete in the all-round and try and win an Olympic gold medal, was I just couldn't handle that. And it was almost like somebody had died. It was really, really tough. And, I know now with, nearly 10 more years of life experience, life is so much bigger than that. And there's so many things in your life that are more important than achieving a goal like that and winning a medal in this material object. But back then it really was the only thing that mattered to me. And so it was tough. And I became a version of myself, somebody that I didn't really like. And it actually took my little brother coming into my room one day, and he basically came in and said, "What are you doing? This isn't you." Because I'm the guy that gets up every morning. If I get injured, I'm going to come back twice as hard. And in many ways, I didn't know what to do. I was lost. And I think off the back of London 2012, for the first time, I'd experienced probably depression and anxiety. I'd not addressed that. And in many ways, a lot of those emotions that I had then, they came back and they hadn't really gone anywhere. They were still there in the back of my mind, and they really came to the forefront of everything that I was feeling at that moment. And my brother said to me, "What are you doing? Like, this isn't you." And I basically told him to F off and get out the room. And the next morning I woke up and something switched, and I thought, actually, I'm gonna try and come back from this and see if I can do it. I'm not gonna give up. I got the surgery. Surgery was really successful. It was a weird experience. I'd always been told by my coach, Sergey, to avoid surgery at all costs, but, I had no choice in this situation. They had to do it. The surgeon told me that before he operated on me and I was under anaesthetic, he could basically spin my ankle around because there just was no stability in it whatsoever. There was nothing there, no ligaments, nothing holding it in place. He did an incredible job. And I didn't really understand how serious my injury was until the first time I went back to see him for my checkup, and the smile on his face and how wide his eyes was, because he was so shocked in himself that he'd been able to fix my ankle so well, that it really hit me just literally how serious it was, what I'd done. And it really was potentially career ending. Now, the rehab for this injury was huge. It was massive. It was a mammoth task. But I had the very best medical staff and medical team around me working on me and trying to do everything to get me back. And I was going to leave no stone unturned. So I remember spending 8 hours a day doing rehab. I was obsessed. I was a man on a mission. And at the time, I'd obviously been injured. I was going to be out for a long time. And there was that World Championships at the end of 2014. And that was going to be my World Championships. I was going to go to the Commonwealth Games. It was going to be my breakthrough competition. I was then going to go to the World Championships as an all-arounder, represent Great Britain and try and start to challenge to win medals. And so it was really difficult because my rehab was based out of the Lilleshall National Sports Centre. So I had to see all of those guys on the team every single day. And at the time that I started to do a bit of training again, a bit of gymnastics-based work, I found it too difficult to be around them. I didn't want to be around them. It was too painful. So I'd go in at lunchtime when they were on their lunch, get my gymnastics done with Sergey, and then I'd leave because I just didn't want to see it. It was too hard for me to see that. They were going to do something that I felt that, was supposed to be me. That was meant to be me there competing there. So that was really hard. That was actually the hardest competition to watch that I ever had, that one. I found that really tough. And it was while I was so far away from anywhere near the Olympic Games in 2016. I was being told that I might never get back. I had this big, massive gap of where I needed to get to if I was ever going to stand a chance of being at the Olympic Games, and I didn't know if I could do it. But I did everything I possibly could. I trained 8 hours a day. I got back in the swimming pool. I had to learn to walk again properly. The team were incredible. We were basically just making up these new rehab strategies to try and figure out a way of getting me back. It was amazing, the efforts people went to try and help me. And my sponsors at the time, Sky Sports, Red Bull, they all helped. They did everything they could. My family were incredible, the people around me. I had an amazing support network, and I certainly wouldn't have got through it without having those people around me. I did the work, and incredibly, just 8 months later, I competed in the all-around event at the European Championships, finishing 6th and winning my 3rd European silver medal in a row on high bar. Now, I look back now and I have no idea how I did that. But in hindsight, coming back so quick was probably was a mistake, because it meant that my body wasn't physically prepared and I hadn't really fully tested my ankle enough. And at the time I was really trying to balance juggling doing most of my rehab and training full time and doing all of that, and it was just too much. And I remember at that European Championships going out there doing incredibly well in the all-around final and hitting 6 for 6. I was super proud of myself. It's an incredible achievement looking back, considering that I was told, 8 months before that I probably wouldn't do floor or vault ever again. But being just completely exhausted, just from the emotion, the stress, the physical demand on my body to get back in just such a short space of time. And when I did get back and I competed at that event and then I qualified for the high bar final, I remember sitting there before going out, doing the warm-up and just saying to Sergey, I'm exhausted. There's nothing left. I just didn't have anything left in me. No emotion, no strength. And I just kind of wanted it to be over. And it's a shame because, I had a real opportunity to win a gold medal in that competition. I was certainly capable of it. I had the most difficult routine in the final, but I just didn't have it. There wasn't the fight left in me. I was done. I did a good routine. In some ways, I kind of probably played it safe and almost felt like if I've been through all of this for 8 months, I need to take something from this. And I won the silver medal. I'm really happy and proud of that. To win 3 back-to-back European silver medals is an amazing thing, especially on an apparatus like high bar, because anything can happen on high bar and it's so easy to fall off. But I was pretty worn out after that competition and I didn't really take a break. I got straight back into it. And then from that moment on, I think the physical toll and the emotional toll that I'd been through for those 8 months started to play out. And the back end of that year going into the World Championships, again, it's going to be that Olympic qualification World Championships. I was kind of on my last legs a little bit and I got injured. I got an injury to that left ankle. I was struggling. I also tore my lat that summer. So I slipped off the high bar, tore my lat muscle. So my training was just all over the place. I was absolutely exhausted. I was doing my best, but I just was nowhere near ready to be anywhere around that World Championships in 2015. And the guys went out there and they got our best result of all time. They finished second in the world. Incredible result to watch. And again, almost flashbacks to 4 years before when I'd missed out on, competing in that test event and then the European Championships where the team had been and won that first gold medal. And I'm now thinking, God, it's going to be really tough now for me to make this Olympic Games. But, at the end of that year, I went on a trip with Sergey to Japan. We kind of refreshed. We worked really well as a team. We put a new gymnastics program together. I did loads of rehab over the winter and we started the year on the back foot for sure, knowing we had a lot of work to do to get back into the mix, let alone be in the team. And the first few competitions of the year were okay. They weren't incredible, but they were good enough. And I was winning medals on high bar, floor. I won a World Cup medal on floor. I did well all round at the British Championships. Wasn't selected for that European Championships team. But I was selected for a few internationals where I'd done well. But going into that year, it was very different to 4 years before. I had been based at the Lilleshall National Sports Centre now for about 18 months. And when I first got based there was me and 6 other gymnasts training there. So it was a really good atmosphere and it was brilliant for me because I'd got to the point training out of Loughborough University where I was one of the only gymnasts left. Everybody else had kind of retired and moved on. So there wasn't anybody to kind of like measure myself up against in the gym day to day. I was the best athlete in the gym and I was many ways just training on my own. So moving to Lilleshall made sense at the time and I could train with 7 of the best gymnasts in the country. And I felt that was going to really help me, especially being on the back foot coming into that Olympic year. But by the time we got to that start of 2016, a lot of the boys had kind of trickled off, gone back to their own clubs, maybe got injured. And there was only myself, Dan Purvis and Christian Thomas. And Christian Thomas was training at Lilleshall, but he lived in Wolverhampton, so was living at home. So it was just me and Dan Purvis in Lilleshall by ourselves. And we basically spent most of our time in our room on our own. And it wasn't a very healthy place to be at the time. There was no escape. It was just gymnastics. And me and Dan were both, aiming for this Olympic Games and feeling the pressure on the back foot a little bit. And I think that was a very unhealthy place for me to be at that time. But my training was going really well and it was getting better and better every single week, every single month. And going into the Olympic trials, I knew that I was going to have to pull off a miracle in many ways, but I'd managed to do that 4 years prior in the British Championships before London 2012. So always in the back of my mind, there was that feeling of, I've done this before. I could do it again. And I had to have this unwavering self-belief and this faith that all of my hard work was going to pay off. I genuinely believed that nobody else had worked as hard as me in the gym for those 2 years. To get back from my injury and to be in that position, I felt that if I was going to earn this Olympic spot, I was going to deserve it if I was going to get one. And I went into the competition, had nothing to lose, and the first Olympic trial, I absolutely smashed it. Again, just like 4 years before, I scored my personal best of that cycle. I scored 89.9. I won the trial. I beat Max at the time, who was the best all-around gymnast. He was world medalist all-round. So I was really full of confidence then going into the second Olympic trial. And I knew that I had really kind of put the cat amongst the pigeons and thrown a spanner in the works, winning that first Olympic trial, because up until that point, I was kind of probably rightly written off because I'd not had any big results. So I went into that second trial knowing everything was on the line. I gave it my very best, did brilliant again, and I finished third in this Olympic trial. So I scored 88.3. So those two scores were brilliant all-around scores, some of the best all-around scores in the whole of that cycle. I'm not quite sure how I pulled those competitions off. I hit all of my routines, although I had a big mistake on the parallel bars, but I didn't fall. I hit all of my difficulty in those two competitions. And I felt, after that competition, I genuinely felt that I'd done enough and I'd earned my spot on my second Olympic team, and I couldn't believe it. You know, looking back to where I'd been on that bed, watching the Commonwealth Games on my TV, my brother coming in and having that conversation with me, being told I would never compete. There was a good chance I wouldn't compete again on floor or vault or in the all-around. To have come all the way back and to now be in a position where I felt like I'd, you know, qualified myself onto an Olympic team and earned it with the scores that I'd done, I just couldn't believe it. It just felt like a dream. It didn't feel real. And I remember waiting there to go up and collect my bronze medal at the second Olympic trial for finishing third all round, and turning next to me, and Niall Wilson was next to me, and saying to Niall, I can't believe I've just done that. I can't believe it. And he kind of said, believe it, you're Sam Oldham, you know? And that was a big moment, but I was still just couldn't believe I'd done that. And I mean, the pressure was unbelievable, and I'd had to convince myself, like I said, have this unwavering faith in myself and this self-belief that was, you know, never going to be shaken, and to have done that. And the vault I did as well, I can remember, it's the only time I've ever done this. The whole week, I just kept visualizing myself sticking my vault. Closed my eyes, and every time I closed my eyes, I'd see myself stick that vault again and again. And this time I wasn't doing the Dragolesco. I couldn't do that anymore. There wasn't enough range in my ankle to ever land backwards like that. So I was just doing the double front. But in my whole gymnastics career, the thousands of handspring double fronts I'd done, in training or in competition, I think I'd only ever stuck probably 3 or 4 of them ever out of thousands. And in that competition, it's probably the most perfect piece of gymnastics I'd ever done. It was like an out-of-body experience. I can't even remember. It's like I'd imagine scoring like a free kick in a World Cup final when the ball leaves your foot, but you can't remember feeling it. It was like it wasn't real. Like I ran down the vault, hit the vault, and I can't even remember touching it. And I stuck this vault, and it was just unbelievable. It was like autopilot. I knew I was going to stick that vault. And that's the power of the mind, I guess, and I'd learnt that in that experience. And that's probably why, ultimately, I'd made it to that point and qualified with the highest score at that first Olympic trial, and then finished third in the second one. And I'd won a lot of apparatus, you know. I think I'd got the highest scores on floor. I was in the top 3 on rings, vault, high bar. I was in the top 4, I think, on pommels and P-bars. So in my head, on paper, I'd done it. I made it to the Olympic Games. Every time I kind of second-guessed it, and basically me and my brother, we drove back from that competition, and every time I'd go, oh yeah, but what if they pick this person? I'd go, oh, no, they can't. Like, they can't do that. Like, on paper, I've got the results. They've got to take me. And that moment with my brother, and my brother was so happy for me. I'll never forget. That's one of the best moments of my life. That car journey back with my brother, where I was convinced I was going to my second Olympic Games after everything I'd been through. And, he was the guy that had that conversation with me that really, flicked the switch in my head and got me back on track. It was an amazing moment. I'll never forget that. And I waited like I did that first time for the phone call, and the phone call came, and I'd been to Tesco to get my food shop for the week. And the phone rang on the way back, and I had a weird feeling, and I pulled into a petrol station, answered the phone, and I was just waiting for those words. All I wanted to hear that was I was selected for my second Olympic Games. And he said, "Unfortunately, you've not been selected for the Olympic Games." And he carried on talking for a few minutes, but I was in complete disbelief. I was in shock. And I drove back, and I did that thing where you drive and you've got no real memory of how you got from A to B, and the emotions I was feeling at the time, it's really hard to explain. And there's a hill at the bottom of my road, and I can remember going to put my foot down, just wanting to drive into the wall. And I got home and I rang back. I rang the head national coach, the man that makes the final decision at the time. I rang him back. And I said, "You need to explain to me why. You've got to explain to me why. Like, I need an explanation. You can't," because I wasn't given one initially. And he gave me the explanation, and he just said that we felt that the balance of the team was better with this gymnast in, rather than you being in the team. And I rang my dad. I was like a mess. And the next 2 weeks were awful. They were horrendous, Again, it felt a bit like my ankle injury. It had, in my head, I'd done everything, and I'd believed that, in the end, if you put the work in and you do everything right, and then you get the scores, then you're supposed to get the good thing at the end. That's what I've been taught my whole life. And, I learned a very harsh lesson that life isn't always fair. And this was never something personal against anybody else that was in the team. And it goes back to that situation at 21 when, Lewis was, fighting his own corner and felt that he should be in it. It was exactly the same situation. It was never a personal thing with any one of the boys that had been selected. All of us, the 20 men that were on that squad, all deserved it, had all put all that work in. But for me, I just couldn't understand why I hadn't been selected. And for the next 2 weeks, I didn't sleep. I trained out at Loughborough University with Sergey, but I'd go into the gym and I didn't really train. I had chose to go down the route of appealing the decision. So that was almost in the hands of the solicitors that were representing me. In the initial instance, one of the gymnasts was taken out of the team, and effectively at that point, the team was open again. Then there was basically an approval panel to decide whether, from what I remember, the process of the selection had been fair. They deemed it was. He got reinstated, that athlete, and I found out, I wasn't going to be going to the Olympic Games. And at that point, I was offered the opportunity to appeal that decision and go to the High Court. I was told that it was going to be £40,000, and if I lost, I would pay that. But they said, "We think you have an extremely high chance of winning this case based on all the evidence we had gathered together and the results over the year." But I was just a broken man at this point, and I wasn't a man. I was a child still. I was only 23, and in many ways, I just wanted it to go away. I wanted the pain to go away. I hadn't trained properly for 2 weeks. I had to compete in a friendly competition in the middle of all of this. I hadn't done any training, and the other two reserves at the time, they went and they did easier routines because they were feeling exactly the same as me. One of them also appealed the decision. But I just felt that if I don't go and do my full routines, that's me, I'm not letting anybody getting one up on me and making me do easy routines. So I decided I'm going to go out there and I'm going to do my full difficulty. I'm not letting that happen. It was a pride thing, I think, for me, but I hadn't trained for 2 weeks. I hadn't slept, and as a reserve, that's what you need. It's your job to be there and ready. And honestly, if somebody had got injured, it would have been very difficult for me to go out there and done the job I needed to do. It was, yeah, it was a crazy experience for me, that, and one that I learned so many lessons from. I think in hindsight now, looking back, I did what was best for me at the time, and I was only 23, and I'm dealing with these emotions and this life experience it's too much. I didn't know how to deal with it. And I think my family actually at the time, they were really struggling because I was almost emotionless. And it had happened to me, and they were getting frustrated that I wasn't more upset or more angry, but I just didn't feel anything. I was almost, the lights were on, but no one was at home, and I was clearly, knowing what I know now, I was depressed, and I was struggling with my mental health massively, and I'd been in that situation where I was living at Lilleshall by myself in solitude all the time, and I'd fixated on this one thing that was going to make all my problems go away, of getting to the Olympics and winning a gold medal, and it was gone. And I felt empty. And I think, looking back now, I learned so much from missing out on the Olympic Games, and I would not change it. Now, I do believe that I should have been there, and I earned my spot on the Olympic Games. And I think if I'd have been selected, I would have continued to get better and better, because I was getting better all year. And I think I'd have gone there and I'd done my job. But like I said, life isn't fair. And actually what it taught me was some incredible life lessons that I've managed to, in many ways, kind of frame my life around since then. I learned, for me, the most important thing is to do the right thing. It is always the right thing to do the right thing. And that's why I say, looking back now, if it was something like that was to happen to me again, like knowing what I know now, I would have taken it all the way to High Court just for the principle, And I'm glad I appealed the decision, because from what I've seen in the past, we're looking at 6 or 7 years since then, I think most decisions now have been based purely on numbers and results, which is great, and that was my reasoning for appealing the decision. I knew it was going to be hard. I knew that I was going to get a lot of backlash off a lot of people, and I was going to be treated in a very certain way, but I didn't want this to ever happen again. I didn't want anyone to work their whole life and then feel like a decision that was made that, wasn't based on the black and white numbers that were scored. So, I think what I did was a brilliant thing, and it has had a real positive impact on the sport and the way teams have been selected since. And I also don't hold any grudges against any of the other athletes, and they did incredibly at the Rio Olympic Games. They finished 4th. They were very close to winning another medal. We had our most successful Olympic Games ever in gymnastics. Max, Lewis, Niall went on and won medals. It was amazing. And I watched that Olympic Games, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed watching it. I wished I was there, but at that point I was kind of over those emotions. But yeah, I think that for me is probably one of the points in my life where I've learned the most lessons about life and myself, and it's helped shape the way I kind of go through and navigate my way through life now. And looking back, off the back of that, I made a similar mistake I made in London, I think, and I kind of avoided a lot of those emotions, and I kind of just got straight back into it. And that was something I then had to deal with a few years down the line. But the Olympic Games and the chance of competing at the Olympic Games, it taught me so much, that experience, and missing out on Rio was a huge part of my life, a huge part of my story, but I wouldn't change a thing. I genuinely wouldn't change a thing. And I was always lucky that, I had the chance of competing at the Olympic Games at the age of 19. I think, at 19, you think, well, this is great. I'm going to go to 2 or 3 more Olympic Games, but that wasn't to be my story. That wasn't going to be my journey. And yeah, I was fortunate that I'd already had that Olympic experience and won an Olympic medal. And, I look back now and I'm really glad that happened. In 2016, I went through that experience and I was strong enough to come the other side, and it's made me who I am and a better person. And the people around me, I have to say thank you to them, because they propped me up in many ways and they helped me. And it was a very difficult period of my life, but one in which I probably learned some of the most valuable lessons I've ever experienced in my nearly 30 years of life. And for me, going to the Olympics and missing out on the Olympics were equally as important. And I guess that's my Olympic story.